Court ruled in a decision that they announced today that reckless domestic abuse still counts as a misdemeanor of domestic violence, which therefore prohibits you from buying a gun. Now, Justice Elena Kagan, who authored the majority opinion on this, said that a person who assaults another recklessly uses force no less than one who carries out the same action knowingly or intentionally. Now, this decision comes from the case Voisin versus the United States, which was brought about by two men who lost their right to own or buy guns because of histories of domestic violence misdemeanors in the state of Maine. Now, under the Lautenberg Amendment, which Congress passed in 1996, individuals convicted of domestic violence misdemeanors can't legally own or buy guns, but lawyers for the two men argued that their crimes didn't qualify for the federal gun ban because their assaults were committed recklessly as opposed to knowingly or intentionally. All right, so under Maine law, a person who acts recklessly when he or she consciously disregards a risk that the person's conduct will cause such a result. Now, in this sort of case, when we're talking about reckless domestic abuse, it might seem a little bit confusing, like what does that mean? And so oftentimes in these sorts of cases, when they're talking about reckless abuse, it's like, oh, the person flew off the handle, they were out of control, they didn't know what they were doing, rather than trying to, having sort of like a prior intent to abusing somebody. So it makes sense that this would fall under what a domestic violence misdemeanor looks like, because you were still committing domestic violence, even if you were in a frenzy of some sort. Now, this is really important because domestic violence actually is positively correlated with gun violence. Now, experts say that if an abuser has access to a gun, victims are 5 times more likely to be killed. Now, there was a study that was published earlier this year that found that simply living in a state with a high rate of gun ownership increases a woman's chance of being fatally shot in a domestic violence situation. Now, this is particularly pertinent right now because the Texas shooter had a history of domestic violence against his wife. Additionally, many are saying that this might have been motivated because of a domestic situation with his mother-in-law. So obviously right now we are talking about this, but we should have been talking about this all along, because it seems with a lot of these mass shooters, in fact, 1 in 6 mass shooters actually have a history of domestic violence. Everybody from James Hodgkinson, who was the man who shot at Congress at the baseball practice, the perpetrator responsible for Virginia Tech, the perpetrator responsible for Pulse nightclub, the Boston Marathon bomber, even the man who drove into the rally at Charlottesville, all had a history of domestic violence. I mean, this seems like a pretty common theme here. What do you guys think about this?
Yeah, these are not one-offs, you know. These people all seem to have some sort of background that suggests other violence on a perhaps less grand scale, but also on a dangerous scale. And the domestic abuse argument, as well as violence against animals, which is an odd congruence also, that really has been shown to be a sort of a pre-indicator of a possible, shall we say, violent outcome. And now we're seeing with all of these cases, I mean, it's insane. We're talking about in hour 1. I mean, all of these mass shootings and mass murders, as the weaponry becomes more sophisticated and more designed to take out more people. These domestic violence correlations of the sort that Hannah's talking about, they really, I think, are a huge cause for concern. And as I say, they might be a predictor of what can happen.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because when you think about it too, it's like if you are willing to inflict harm and inflict violence on somebody who you supposedly love and are in a romantic relationship,
planned or unplanned,
of course you like are also capable of then inflicting some sort of violence on strangers. And so I do think that it is a predictor, right? If you have those sorts of tendencies, and if you have that, even that capability, I think that makes sense, unfortunately.
And that one stat, I'm sorry I would jump in, but that one stat I thought was so telling, where that if there's a gun in the home.
Yeah, they're 5 times more likely. And I'm from South Carolina, so, and people love their gun laws in my home state. So that kind of struck a nerve with me as far as safety is concerned. But yeah, I think that this is on a right path when it comes to gun laws. And I just don't understand, I guess, why we can't make more sensible laws like this to constrict guns from just, being, in people's homes or,
Yeah, I mean, when you look at things that can actually curb mass shootings, right? Like obviously, universal background checks help. Obviously, making
mental health,
looking at mental health. Obviously, looking at in terms of domestic abuse and prohibiting people who have a history of domestic abuse from attaining guns, even though sometimes there are loopholes and they can attain them through, private sellers and things like that. Like they can all mitigate it to some extent. But when you look at the things that actually curb mass shootings, it's reducing the amount of guns. Like that's the truth and that's the facts. Like if you look at, states where they have reduced the amount of guns, then you see that there's a reduction in violence. And so I think this
gun
is
violence,
like, gun violence, gun violence. And I think that that's a no-brainer. I mean, America has more guns, per capita than any other developed country, and American women are thus 16 times more likely to be shot and killed than women in developed countries. Like I think we need to look at the numbers here. We need to look at the facts here. And like Ava was saying, is change our laws accordingly. Like it doesn't make sense that there are more guns. And I understand there's people, just really quick, I understand that there are people who, feel that, for some people in southern states and rural areas and things like that, that it is a hobby, right? If you are,
it's part of the culture.
It's part of the culture, whatever. Yeah. It's a hobby or something like that, where you want to go out and hunt and things like that. But if I like yoga, if my hobby was killing people, I would say, okay, let's close down some yoga studios. I get it. Do you know what I mean?
With some people, especially being from the South, it's embedded in their culture. And if they're not going out and doing harm, and they don't really see. Ultimately, gun laws will affect everyone. And if they're not doing anything but hunting and not, harming people, then they don't really see why their guns need to be taken for someone else's actions. And so it becomes like this huge debate as to, well, why does my gun have to leave? I didn't do anything wrong versus,
I understand. I mean, I get the logic there, but when we're talking
I don't like
about
guns,
2 mass shootings within a month, essentially, at some point, I understand that you don't want, other people's actions to affect yours, but at some point, we have to say enough is enough. Enough people have died that you can give up some of your rights.
And what do you think about this argument that these 2 men are actually coming forward saying that, well, we acted recklessly and it wasn't planned, so we should, have our gun laws back? What do you think about that? I think that that's a scary debate to have.
Well, domestic violence typically is a crime or an act of passion, of anger. I mean, it's not premeditated typically. Almost by definition, domestic violence isn't that way. So oftentimes alcohol accompanies it, or there's an argument and then no one anticipated the argument, or if they did, they certainly didn't anticipate that it would end in violence. And I think in this case, that's where this becomes very important, because a lot of people can say, well, look, I want a gun to protect my domicile, my home, whatever. Okay, but there's certainly certain histories that should accept you from being able to own a gun, and domestic violence should be one of those things. That's why those stats that Hannah had mentioned are so important in this conversation. So yeah, you can have your gun for your home, but if you have a history of domestic abuse, we don't want that gun in the home.
And the fact that this is even being argued is crazy to me. I think that, domestic violence and other tracks of history, they go hand in hand with either owning a gun or not. So I just, I'm for it.
Yeah, I think if you are a perpetrator of violence, like we talked about with animal cruelty,
you should not
and things like that, if you are a perpetrator of violence, regardless of what weapon or your hands or whatever it may be, you should then not be able to you should not have the access to have some sort of other tool to then perpetrate more violence and more potentially fatal violence. So we'll we'll see. I mean, I'm glad that the justices ruled against that. And I think that's an important ruling, especially right now.
TYT membership gets you commercial-free Young Turks. Download it, stream it, podcast it, get all the network shows, and support independent media. TYTnetwork.com/join.